My name is Nate, and welcome to Wesensschau. Today we'll be discussing alcohol and the Bible. In recent Western history, we have seen two sort of attitudes adopted towards the use of wine. We've seen one of absolute prohibition and another one of absolute legal relaxation. But what does the Bible tell us? For those looking for a quick answer, I think the biblical position on wine or alcohol is pretty straightforward and wonderfully spelled out in the Deuterocanonical book of Sirach, chapter 31, verses 25 to 30. Do not aim to be valiant over wine, for wine has destroyed many. Fire and water prove the temper of steel, so wine tests hearts in the strife of the proud. Wine is like life to men, if you drink it in moderation. What is life to a man who is without wine? It has been created to make men glad. Wine drunk in season and temperately is rejoicing of heart and gladness of soul. Wine drunk to excess is bitterness of soul, with provocation and stumbling. Drunkenness increases the anger of a fool to his injury, reducing his strength and adding wounds. If the Deuterocanon isn't a satisfying source for you, despite its catechetical use in the early church, I will also refer you to Psalm 104, verses 14 to 15. He causeth the grass to grow for the cattle, and herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth, and wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face to shine, and bread which strengtheneth man's heart. Now, the question is, what does wine in this context actually mean? Is it alcoholic wine or unfermented grape juice? There's 4 different Hebrew words used in the Old Testament to describe wine. There is yayin, tirosh, shekar, and asis. Almost every argument for the biblical case against the use of alcohol tries to distinguish between these different words for wine qualitatively, claiming that there is a clear biblical distinction made between fermented or alcoholic wine and unfermented or non-alcoholic wine. Generally speaking, the argument is as follows. Yayin and shikar refer to varyingly intoxicating wines or general alcoholic drinks, sometimes translated as strong drink, with shikar being the stronger of the two. Asis and tirosh, on the other hand, refer to a new wine, which is sweeter and non-alcoholic. Now, there are definitely distinctions to be made between shikar, yayin, and tirosh, but the question is one of these distinctions the entire qualitative lack of alcohol in tirosh, in new wine? I'm going to argue that it isn't, and that tirosh is just less alcoholic and sweeter, while still maintaining its inebriating qualities. For example, let's look back to Psalm 104:15, which uses yayin to describe wine which makes the heart of man merry, or glad. Now let's look at Isaiah 24, verses 6 to 9, which reads as follows. Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men left. The new wine, tirosh, mourneth, the vine languisheth, all the merry-hearted do sigh. The mirth of tabrets ceaseth, the noise of them that rejoice endeth, the joy of the harp ceaseth. They shall not drink wine, yayin, with a song. Strong drink, shakar, shall be bitter to them that drink it. It's clear here that the distinction to be made between tirosh and yayin and shakar is not the unfermented quality of tirosh. Psalm 104 tells us that yayin makes the heart of man merry, and in Isaiah 24 we see that it's the merry-hearted who drink the new wine, or tirosh. Isaiah 24 also naturally switches between tirosh, yayin, and shakar to describe this wine wrath judgment of God, which is a theme we see present throughout the Old Testament, which culminates in the Eucharistic judgment of Revelation, where God pours out wine over the earth. Isaiah 49:26 tells us a similar story using asis in the context of drunkenness at the judgment of God. Asis is also used in Joel 1:5 in parallel with yayin to describe again the wine wrath of God. While these different wines may vary in their alcoholic content, it's more than clear that the Old Testament makes no particular distinction between fermented and unfermented wine. The distinction is rather that of a quantitative difference, where these different wines have varying alcoholic contents. Proverbs tells us to be weary of wine because it can be very dangerous, And we're told not to be given over to drunkenness, a commandment which is echoed multiple times in the New Testament. Leviticus tells the priests not to drink wine in the tabernacle for discernment's sake, a commandment echoed in Proverbs 31, saying that kings should not drink wine while officiating, lest they forget their decrees and deprive the oppressed of justice. This will be discussed more shortly, but for now let's look to the New Testament to see if perhaps there's a Greek distinction to be made between fermented and unfermented wine. In the Old Testament, or in Hebrew, the verb commonly translated as getting drunk is shakar, but that can also mean feeling merry. And just as with Hebrew, in Greek, the verb for getting drunk, metuo, can also mean simply feeling merry. We see this in verses such as John 2:10 and Acts 2:15. We can also see metuo used in the context of merriness as opposed to drunkenness in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in verses such as Genesis 9:21 and Sirach 1:18. These are both important verses that we'll get back to later. Similarly to Hebrew, in Greek there's also three different words used for what in English we refer to as wine in the New Testament. And all three of these words, just as the four words in Hebrew to describe wine, are used in contexts which indicate their inebriating qualities. We have oinos in Luke 7, verses 33 to 35, and in 1 Timothy 3:8, Titus 1:7, Ephesians 5:18, etc. We have gloikos in Acts 2:13, and sikara in Luke 1:15. So just as with the Hebrew words for wine in the Old Testament, the Greek words for wine in the New Testament, although they may have a quantitative distinction on how much alcohol they contain, there is no qualitative distinction made between fermented and unfermented wine. All the words used for wine in the New Testament are used in contexts which show that they have the potential or they have the capability to be used to make a man drunk. The institution of the Eucharist by Christ was with fermented wine. Now, the wine used in the early church was mixed with water, but it was not mixed with water enough to make it practically akin to grape juice, as some people claim. If this wine, which is transubstantiated into the Eucharistic blood of Christ, wasn't alcoholic, how could the Corinthians get drunk off of it, as we read in 1 Corinthians 11? Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and Cyprian of Carthage all describe the Eucharistic cup which is offered unto God to be transfigured into the blood of Christ as wine mixed with water, or as mirum mixed with water, mirum being the word for alcoholic wine. As we're told in the Gospels, the cup of the Last Supper was filled with the quote-unquote fruit of the vine, which some may deny is alcoholic, but a quick glance throughout the Old Testament narratival unfolding towards this event tells us a much different story. To understand wine in the New Covenant, we have to first understand wine in the Old Covenant. What typological narratives or symbolic relationships have been established in the Old Testament, which will aid us in understanding the eschatological fullness of wine in the New Testament? When reading the Old Testament, we have to understand the intentionality of every detail, every word, and every image. When we hear something, like this passage in Amos 9 and Joel 3, which reads, "The mountains will drip with sweet wine," we can understand that it's not an irrelevant way of describing things, and that the Holy Spirit intends to paint us a very symbolically rich image. To understand why passages like this, which use this particular language, are so significant, let's look back to the first few chapters of Genesis. Genesis 1:11-12, the third creation day, we're told of two types of plants that were created on this day, those being the plants seeding seed and the trees bearing fruit. These are the sacramental plants, which provide us with grain and fruit, which we are then to sacramentally transform into bread, wine, and oil for use in the temple. These are the plants which man encounters first in the Edenic garden sanctuary, which rests at the center of all creation, wherein man was intended to commune with God, to work the creation, and to share a sabbatical meal of bread and wine with our Creator. Genesis 2:5, which takes place on the sixth day of creation, tells us of the shrubs of the field which hadn't been created yet. The word used for shrubs here is not commonly used in Scripture, and as per its association with drought and waterlessness, a la Genesis 21:15 and Job 30, the shrubless land is to be held in contrast with the well-watered Garden of Eden. Genesis 2:5 also tells us of the grain that had not sprouted yet, as grain requires water to grow and man to cultivate it, or to harvest it. Man's task, therefore, as gardener and cultivator of creation, was to descend the mountain garden of Eden, following the four rivers which flow out into all creation, leading us towards these areas of rich natural resources, as outlined in the geography of Genesis 1 to 2. We are then told to gather these resources and to transform them into something new. Uh, Man's task as cultivator of creation is a Eucharistic task of going out as a co-creator with God, accepting the gift of creation He has given us with thanks, transforming it into something new through the particular creative abilities that God gifts each of us individually and corporately, and then we offer it up unto God as a Eucharistic sacrifice, which is dialogically transformed into something greater. Because of man's sin, however, he was barred from the sabbatical meal of wine with God, and he was unable to access the fruit of the garden's trees. And he couldn't transform these Edenic grapes or this Edenic fruit into a more mature wine to share with God on the Sabbath. Man had to flee the garden and toil laboriously, working through thorns and thistles to bring forth the grain of the field. Now, the curse of thorns and thistles of Genesis 3 is in parallel with and to be held in contrast with the two plants we're told of in Genesis 2:5. It's because of man's inappropriate cultivation and encounter with creation that the land now brings out thorns and thistles. And it isn't until man passes through the cherubic swords of fire at the gates of Eden that we can re-enter into God's sanctuary and drink of the sabbatical wine with God. The cultivation of grain, in light of wine being barred from man's grasp, and the land bringing forth the fruits of our inappropriate encounter with creation, the thorns and thistles, it's a theme that runs throughout the entire Old Testament, and we will see that it isn't until the institution of the Eucharist, under the blood of the new covenant of Jesus Christ, that we can finally share the eschatological meal with God. The curse of Genesis 3 is the curse of exile, and part of that is the sorrow and toil of harvest. To rest on the sabbatical throne of fruitfulness, man must work the ground by the sweat of his brow. A more accurate translation of sweat of the brow would be sweat of the nostrils, which calls back to breathing of life into man through his nostrils. Man must pour out the life which was breathed into him to re-enter into the vineyard of Eden and to share the sabbatical drink of wine with God. And this is why the description of Jesus on the cross, where he breathes his last breath and then his side is pierced, from which water and wine flows out, is such a meaningful and important description that reveals to us a typological and symbolic meaning that undergirds the narrative leading up to this point throughout the Old Testament. This language in Genesis 3 of toil, sorrow, and rest is picked up in the last few verses of Genesis 5, in the introduction of Noah as the son of Lamech. Lamech names his son Noah, which is the Hebrew word for rest, as it is through Noah that rest from the toil and sorrow of Genesis 3 is to be achieved. Noah, in contrast to Adam, who sought to achieve glory and eat of the heavenly feast on his own terms, Noah obeys God, and after 6 centuries, on the 601st year of Noah's life, the beginning of the 7th or Sabbath century of his life, Noah exits the ark, worships God, and plants a vineyard, which he then uses to make and drink wine, from which he felt merry. From the corrupted, thorn-ridden earth, the ark was elevated onto a mountain, mountains being symbolic of the garden sanctuary of Eden, which is symbolic of man as a meeting place between heaven and earth. And it's on this mountain that Noah rests from his labor, disrobes himself, which is symbolic of him alleviating himself of his kingly duties or office, and he drinks wine. In Hebrew, we are told that Noah got drunk, using the verb shakar, which is translated in the Septuagint as metuo. But as we discussed earlier, this doesn't necessarily mean he got drunk, it means that he felt merry. This is the same word that's used in Sirach 1, verse 18, which tells us that wisdom, the second person of the Trinity, makes those obedient to God drunk with her gifts, or to feel merry with her gifts. Noah's merriness from wine was a reward of rest for his righteousness and obedience to God. Some say this act of Noah is his recapitulation of the Adamic sin, but they're wrong. There is a recapitulation of the sin in Eden following the recreation of Eden after the flood, but that sin is the rebellion of Ham, not the drinking of wine by Noah. Ham attempts to seize kingship for himself, revolting against his father, of whom he is in the image of through the overshadowing of the Spirit, a topic which will be discussed in a future video. Noah's drinking of wine was simply his entering into rest from his office. What Adam failed to do, which is obey God and enjoy the sabbatical wine of rest at the right time, is what Noah accomplishes in Genesis 9. This sacramental kingship, symbolized by bread and wine, is then passed through the overshadowing of the Spirit through Shem, the son of Noah, who, as king of Salem, gifts Abraham bread and wine under the priestly name of Melchizedek. Noah's drinking of wine is his rest from his office of authority as king of creation, who is given the kingly commandments of acting on behalf of God in the world as the avenger of creation. Wine is the drink of kingship. It is the eschatological drink of enthronement. Bread is a very simple food. Just as priesthood is a very simple office, bread is the food of priests, and wine is the drink of kings. Priesthood is the office of listening to God and obeying the statutes of the covenant. Kingship, on the other hand, is the office of wisdom, a much more complicated office. We can see the progression from priest to king in the general structure of the Old Testament, as well as in the lives of particular people in the Old Testament. First, God lays out the law and you obey it. That's the priestly section. And then, as you become more mature and new questions are raised, you have to use wisdom to discern the answer. Answers which aren't always present on the surface of the laws given to you by God. This is what Solomon does in the famous story of the two women fighting over the baby. Nowhere in the Torah does God tell us how to deal with that situation. But because Solomon was wise and he had studied God's laws, and he understood the rhythm and the mode by which God participates in the world, he understood the concepts which allowed him to make the right decision. Bread is very easy to make, whereas wine is a little bit more difficult of a process. Wine also requires wisdom when drinking it. The line between merry and drunk is pretty blurry, and so one must exercise kingly wisdom when drinking it. Bread, on the other hand, like the priestly statutes of God, is very simple. The law is very simple. You either break a law or you don't. There's not a lot of nuance. Priests are in charge of the showbread. Bread is priestly food. Kings, on the other hand, have bakers and cupbearers, like Joseph, who acted as a king over creation, a mediator between heavenly blessing and creation. It is through Joseph that the nations were blessed with bread and wine. Wine is an eschatological drink of maturity. You don't drink wine as a baby, just as you don't drink wine in the morning. Wine is the drink of adults and the drink of the evening. Proverbs 31 tells us to give wine to those who are near the end of their lives. Wine is the drink which ends a cycle and begins a new one. This transitional quality is inherently sabbatical. The Sabbath is the period of relaxation and lingering in the moment. The Sabbath is a period of rest, allowing the work of the week to linger, the sweet scent of creativity finding its narratival place in the temporal movement towards God. Likewise, wine is the drink of rest and relaxation. Both with rest and with wine, if sought after out of their hierarchical place, they will not bring structure and narrative to life, but instead they'll bring laziness, drunkenness, and chaos. The Sabbath and wine alike require wisdom to be interacted with properly. Leviticus 10 forbids the drinking of wine in the tabernacle. Wine is, however, used in the tabernacle as a drink offering before the Lord later on, as is discussed extensively in the book of Numbers. While Israel is in Exodus, they do not participate in the drink offering, as they are exiled from the garden sanctuary of the Edenic Promised Land. Deuteronomy speaks extensively of the blessing to come, of much fruit of the wine, a wine-rich promised land which is waiting for the exiled Israelites to inherit. Similarly, Nazarites, as temporary priests who have vowed themselves to holy war, must abstain from wine for the entirety of their vow. Like a king in battle, priests, Nazarites, and Israelites in the wilderness require wisdom to defeat their spiritual enemies. War and leisure are not times to be confused with each other. And we see in 1 Samuel 19, a symptom of Saul's madness is his inability to fight during times of war and to relax and feast during times of peace. It is only after the enemy that has been defeated that the sabbatical enthronement of rest can come. It is only after the vow has been completed and the holy war has been fought and won that the Nazarite can drink wine. Just as the priests couldn't drink wine when serving in the temple, Jesus refrained from drinking wine when he was performing his high priestly service of sacrifice on the cross. He did drink wine with his disciples prior to his arrest in Gethsemane. It is after the priestly task of sacrifice that Jesus is enthroned as a king and dines with his bride with drinks of wine. Jesus now sits at the Father's right hand, resting and inviting his bride into his presence to participate in his eternal joy by eating bread and wine. This is to be held in contrast with Adam, who seized the fruit before the task of priestly obedience was over, and so the sacramental fruit proved to be too holy for his unsanctified self. Throughout the Old Testament, we see wine as a fruit of blessing. Marriage, increase in crop, increase in household are all blessings which occur in parallel with each other. We see throughout Deuteronomy and the prophetic books a promise of increase in household and in crop for those who obey God. Isaiah 24-25 tells us of the removal of the wicked who have gotten drunk on wine before the time is right, and the oppressors who have forsaken the laws of God. These are the direct sins against the commandments of Proverbs 31 for kings to refrain from strong drink while sobriety is necessary. The wicked are removed from office in drunken chaos, and in Isaiah 24 and in Isaiah 25, God establishes his own feast of wine, where his bride, who has waited humbly and lovingly, are exalted, and they join God in a joyous marriage feast. In Isaiah 25, verse 7, God lifts the veil off his bride, and heaven and earth become one, just as man lifts the veil off his wife, and the two flesh become one. Song of Songs is all about this joyous eros of blessed union, and like all marriage feasts, includes the drinking of wine. When you drink wine or alcohol, it feels like a sort of fire. It has a particular heat to it. And as we read in Song of Songs 8, love is the quote-unquote flame of Yah. That's a literal translation of what the KJV translates inaccurately as a most vehement flame. Love is literally the flame of Yah, the flame of God. Wine, if not drunk in excess, as we are told in Sirach 31, is a blessing, and it opens you up towards union with others. This ecstatic opening up towards others is the Christian task of becoming one as Christ and his Father are one. Song of Songs shows us that wine and marriage are joyous blessings which open us up towards a familial consubstantiality. This doesn't mean, of course, that sex and alcohol are always good. These goods can be perverted and can bring curses instead of blessings when interacted with inappropriately. As soon as marriage or sex and alcohol spark a self-referential passion, which doesn't lead you up towards a greater good, it becomes a stumbling block. Proverbs tells us all about the dangers of alcohol and sex. Women and strong drink are rich in potentiality. The strange woman of Proverbs isn't necessarily evil, and in fact, as we see with the Queen of Sheba, if interacted with properly, she can bring much blessing and glory to a man. Alcohol is the same way. Alcohol can open a door towards consubstantiality and unity, but if interacted with out of the hierarchical order of things, it can become an oppressive stumbling block, preventing one from ascending the ladder of divine ascent. This is why monks avoid women and alcohol. Alcohol can be very dangerous, and the Old and New Testament alike are not short of warnings against getting drunk. There is, however, a hierarchical place for alcohol as a source of merriness and as a tool towards ascension and communion. Let us recall the passage read at the beginning of the video, Sirach chapter 31, particularly just verse 26, which tells us, "Fire and water prove the temper of steel, so wine tests hearts in the strife of the proud." How someone interacts with alcohol is a great demonstration of their capacity towards wisdom. Wine is a kingly drink, and thus it requires kingly wisdom. When a fool drinks wine, he gets drunk and he does stupid things. But when a wise man drinks, he relaxes and he's opened up towards others others in a loving and in a very or non-narcissistic way. In Genesis 2 to 3, man is commanded to work and to bring an offering unto God, to send a sweet scent up to God, and so God comes down to eat with man on the Sabbath. Man fails to accomplish this, he plays the harlot with the devil, and so when God comes down to inspect man, the life-giving fruit of the garden proves to be a curse instead of a blessing, as man had encountered it inappropriately. In Numbers 5, we see this inspection process ritualized and instituted as a way of testing for adultery and unfaithfulness. Now, we aren't given any concrete examples of any men testing their wives in this jealousy inspection throughout Scripture, but we see many cases of God testing his bride in a jealousy inspection. The first one, of course, being in Genesis 3. In Leviticus 2, we are told of the tribute or memorial offering, wherein the priests call upon God to remember his covenant and to come down to share a meal with his bride. This is the offering up of the resources which man explores outside the garden to collect and transform, acting as a co-creator with God. God then comes down to inspect his bride, who then shares a meal with God in the peace offering. If God's bride has interacted with creation and with God faithfully and properly, the offerings will be a blessing. But if they have dealt falsely with God and his creation, it acts as a curse. The memorial offering later has a drink offering added onto it, the pouring out of wine for God. Man doesn't get to drink the wine with God until the New Covenant. All the offerings and the feasts of the Old Testament find their eschatological fulfillment in the Eucharist, the pure offering prophesied of in Malachi 1:11. Man is now allowed to drink wine with God. The Eucharist is the ultimate jealousy inspection, wherein man goes out and cultivates the grain and fruit, transforming it into the Eucharistic gifts, pouring out the life given to us by God into these gifts, and then offering it up unto God for God to then send his Spirit down and dine with us. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 11 that this is a jealousy inspection, that if you have been unfaithful, the Eucharist will be like unto a curse, whereas if you have dealt righteously, it will be a blessing unto life eternal. The drink of marriage feasts is wine. Wine is the drink of the eschatological coming down of God on Mount Zion, and the pouring out of his Spirit upon all creation, the final inspection. In Isaiah 66, we see the bridal feast between heaven and earth established on Mount Zion, the New Jerusalem, the glorified Eden. We see the same image in Revelation 21 of the pyramidal city from which holy water flows out and fills the entire cosmos. In Isaiah 66:20, we see the Gentiles, or the nations, brought in through the Eucharistic and agricultural prune hooks and plowshares of Isaiah 2, being offered unto God as memorial offerings. The word there is mincha, which is the same word used in Leviticus 2. Recall that in John 6, the Eucharist is established as the ultimate memorial offering. Ezekiel 47 tells us of the holy water, which fills creation and regenerates even the Dead Sea. To bring this all back to the image established at the beginning of the video, this holy water is the same sweet wine which drips from the mountains of Joel 3 and Amos 9. In Joel 3, we're told this wine flows even unto the deepest valleys, filling and exalting the nations, bringing them back to God as acacia trees. Acacia was a wood used in the construction of the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies. So this is God's presence through the sweet wine of the mountains of Joel 3 and Amos 9, flowing out into all creation and making all of creation a holy of holies. Wine is the eschatological drink which eucharistically flows out of God's temple mountain, fills all of creation, and brings it back to God in his offering, which is to be dialogically transformed and perfected. This wine which flows from God's mountain is also a curse unto the wicked, as we see in the language of wine wrath throughout the prophetic books, and it's finalized in the Eucharistic wine press, which separates the wheat from the chaff in John's Revelation. John is told to take and eat a scroll, which is the Word of God. This is the same commandment given to the apostles at the Last Supper, and is the means by which God interacts with, inspects, and communes with the world. This is the Eucharistic assimilation of heaven into earth, and the bringing up of earth into heaven. God pours out bowls of wine on the earth, and it is through this wine that God inspects his bride. The righteous are exalted and brought up to the mountain towards the marriage supper of Mount Zion, and the wicked are carried away in their drunkenness. The same wine which exalts the righteous and infuses them into the body of Christ is the wine which is a curse unto the wicked, who have grown incompatible with the presence of God. To conclude, if you have encountered wine and strong drink inappropriately, it will be drunkenness and chaos unto you, whereas if you have encountered it righteously, it will be a blessing and bring merriness. The Corinthians, as seen in 1 Corinthians 11, were encountering the Eucharist and wine inappropriately, and so Paul warned against this, as when God came down to inspect and dine with them, his presence was like a curse, as they were not prepared to encounter him properly, and thus people were getting sick and dying. And so, when kings in the Old Testament inappropriately encounter alcohol and God's other instruments of blessing, we see God's blessings act as curses. We see this in Saul, when the Spirit of God comes down, Saul is made a fool of. When you're incompatible with the coming down of God, when God does come down and fill you with the Spirit, you do foolish things. Wine is the glorified water of the new covenant. The Eucharistic wine, which becomes the blood of Christ, when consumed, is like the Spirit coming down and inspecting you. As the flame of the Spirit descends on the sacrifices to raise them up, wine goes down, it feels like a flame as it goes down your throat. Just experientially, that's what it feels like. It feels hot, it feels like fire. And when alcohol is encountered appropriately, it opens you up towards a consubstantiality and social dialogue. The baptism of Christ is understood in the Orthodox Church as the universal blessing of all waters, and so the institution of the Eucharist can be understood as the sanctification of all foods and drinks, including all alcoholic beverages. Obviously, not all alcoholic drinks are the body and blood of Christ, but because of what Christ did, we have a clear example on how we are to encounter and interact with alcohol as a fruit of potentiality towards social dialogue, consubstantiality, and the marriage of heaven and earth. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, leave a like, let me know what you guys think about this topic in the comments below. Let me know what you want to hear more of in the future. Please pray for me, and may God bless you.